She vanished on a blistering July afternoon. 9-year-old Amelia Vance, a quiet girl with a sketchbook full of monsters and heroes, was there one moment and gone the next. For 3 years, her disappearance was a ghost that haunted the small, dying town of Harmony Creek, Ohio. A cold story, a forgotten file in a dusty cabinet, a family shattered into silence. Then, in 2001, a cleanup crew was hired to tear it all down, to erase the memory of the house where tragedy lived. They were there to clear away the rot and ruin of the past. But in the back of the property, they found something that had been waiting, something left behind. Inside a rusty cast iron tomb, they found the answer to a question no one had dared to ask. Not where Amelia went, but what remained of her presence. A faded red dress, charred and abandoned. This isn't just the story of a missing girl. This is the story of a secret, a burnt offering, and a discovery so horrifying it would tear a town apart all over again. Harmony Creek, Ohio, in the summer of 1998, was a town holding its breath and had been for a long time. It was a place where the American dream had sputtered and died, leaving behind a quiet desperation that settled like dust on the cracked sidewalks of Main Street. The local auto parts factory, a hulking brick monolith that had once been the lifeblood of the community, had closed its doors 5 years earlier. It didn't just take jobs, it took the town's very identity, leaving a gaping wound that refused to heal. The closure triggered a slow, agonizing bleed. The young and ambitious, seeing no future in the rearview mirror, packed their bags and sought fortunes elsewhere, leaving behind an aging population and a palpable sense of a world that had moved on without them. Harmony Creek became a town of memories, of stories of better days told over lukewarm coffee at the one remaining diner, stories that only made the present feel more hollow. The once bustling Main Street was now a sad parade of boarded-up storefronts, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at a future that wasn't coming. The old hardware store, the family-owned grocer, the single-screen movie theater, all gone. Casualties of a changing world, and the arrival of a sprawling Walmart in the county seat, a 45-minute drive away. It was in this town, in a small, weathered farmhouse on the edge of the dense woods that separated civilization from wilderness, that the Vance family was slowly, quietly coming apart at the seams. If you enjoy fictional mysteries like this one, be sure to hit that subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more stories like Amelia's to light. With that said, let's get right into the story. 9-year-old Amelia Vance was a watcher. She saw the world in a way others didn't, noticing the small, quiet details that most people overlooked. She saw the intricate, dew-kissed geometry of a spider's web, the way the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the great oak tree in her backyard, casting dancing patterns on the grass. And she saw the silent, invisible wall that had grown between her parents, a tension so thick it felt like another presence in their small, cluttered home. Her sketchbook was her sanctuary, a private world where she was the architect. Its pages were filled with the fantastical creatures that lived in her boundless imagination. Winged foxes with knowing eyes, gentle giants made of moss and stone, and shadowy figures that lurked at the edges of the page, their forms indistinct but their presence menacing. It was a world where she was in control, a stark contrast to the one she inhabited. Her father, Robert, was a man adrift in the sea of his own failure. Before the factory closed, his laughter had been a constant, rumbling presence in the house, a sound that made the floorboards vibrate. He had been a man of simple pride, his callous hands a testament to a life of honest work. But the loss of his job had been an amputation of his soul. Now he spent his days in a self-imposed exile on the back porch, a ghost in his own home, drowning his simmering anger and suffocating shame in a steady stream of cheap beer. His silence was a heavy blanket that smothered all conversation. Her mother, Eleanor, moved with a brittle, frantic energy, a woman held together by sheer force of will. Her smiles were thin, fleeting things that never quite reached her perpetually tired eyes. The long shifts at the county superstore, a job she despised, paid the bills but chipped away at her spirit, a constant reminder of the life she had lost. She was the glue holding the family together, but she was stretched to the breaking point, her patience worn as thin as the soles of her work shoes. On a blistering afternoon in late July, the air thick and heavy with the buzz of cicadas, Amelia sat in her usual spot beneath the great oak tree. She wore her favorite faded red dress, a hand-me-down she loved for the way it spun out when she twirled, a splash of vibrant color against the parched, brown grass. Her sketchbook was open on her lap, the soft, rhythmic scratching of her pencil a quiet counterpoint to the drone of a distant crop duster. Around 2 o'clock, Eleanor's voice, familiar and weary, cut through the humid air from the kitchen window, a command to stay out of the sun. Amelia, lost in her world of graphite and paper, waved a distracted hand without looking up. It was the last time her mother would ever see her. An hour later, Robert stumbled onto the back porch, his face flushed, his eyes unfocused. The backyard was empty. The world seemed to have gone unnaturally still. The sketchbook lay open on the grass, a half-finished drawing of a winged fox staring up at the vacant, unforgiving sky. The swing set, a rusted relic of happier times, creaked a lonely, rhythmic complaint in the faint breeze. But Amelia was gone. The initial hours were a chaotic blur of rising panic. Eleanor's frantic calls to neighbors, her voice growing shriller, more desperate with each unanswered question. Robert's clumsy, heavy-footed search through the overgrown property, his calls of his daughter's name growing hoarse and raw. He thrashed through the thorny bushes at the edge of the woods, his mind a thick fog of alcohol and fear, the world tilting and spinning around him. By dusk, the illusion of normalcy was shattered completely. The blue and red lights of Sheriff Al Brody's cruiser pulsed against the weathered siding of the farmhouse, a silent, flashing admission that something was terribly wrong. The search for answers that followed was a study in futility, a slow-motion tragedy played out against the backdrop of a town that had already seen its share of loss. Sheriff Al Brody, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a deep-seated weariness, was more accustomed to settling property disputes and dealing with teenage mischief than hunting for a lost child. He was a good man, an honest man, but he was a man of a bygone era, and he was out of his depth. His department was small, underfunded, and ill-equipped for a mystery of this magnitude. He did what he could. Volunteers, their faces etched with a mixture of grim determination and fear, combed the dense, menacing woods that bordered the Vance property. Divers, their forms alien and otherworldly in their black wetsuits, searched the murky, impenetrable depths of Miller's Pond. Amelia's smiling school picture, a portrait of innocence frozen in time, was plastered on telephone poles and in the windows of the few remaining businesses on Main Street. Her image was distributed by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a name that sent a chill down the spine of every parent in town. But this was 1998, a world on the cusp of a technological revolution that had not yet reached Harmony Creek. There were no cell phone pings to track, no surveillance footage to review, no digital breadcrumbs to follow. The search was fundamentally analog, relying on human memory, a notoriously flawed and unreliable narrator. The Vances, hollowed out by a grief so profound it was almost a physical presence, gave conflicting, hazy timelines. Their memories of the afternoon were a fractured mosaic of fear and regret. Brenda Gable, the lonely widow next door whose life revolved around observing the comings and goings of her neighbors, offered a rambling, contradictory account of a strange car on their road, her story changing with each telling, colored by her own judgments and assumptions about the Vances' troubled lives. Kyle Rossi, a troubled 17-year-old with long, greasy hair and a sullen attitude, became an early person of interest. He was known for smoking marijuana in the woods behind the Vance property, a shadowy figure on the periphery of the town's respectable society. He was questioned, his small trailer searched, but he was quickly cleared. He claimed he hadn't been near the Vance property that day, a lie that would haunt him for years. Our stories like this one keep viewers on the edge of their seats. If you're enjoying this mystery, tap like and subscribe to join our community of true crime enthusiasts. The days bulled into weeks, the weeks into months. The search parties dwindled, the volunteers returning to their own lives, their own families, their own quiet fears. The media, once a constant, intrusive presence, packed up their vans and moved on to the next tragedy. The silence in the Vance house, once just a symptom of a troubled marriage, grew into a cavernous, suffocating entity. It was a silence filled with unspoken accusations, with the ghosts of things left unsaved, with a grief so heavy it eventually fractured the family completely. In the fall of 1999, Robert and Eleanor divorced. The house was abandoned, left to the mercy of the seasons, a decaying monument to a tragedy the town desperately tried to forget. Eleanor moved 2 towns over, finding work as a night shift supervisor at a distribution center. Robert disappeared into a bottle, his whereabouts becoming as much a mystery as his daughter's. By the spring of 2001, the Vance house was no longer a home, it was a ghost story. It stood on the edge of town, a local landmark of loss, a place children whispered about on their way home from school and adults avoided, their eyes skittering away as they drove past. The yard was a jungle, a chaotic tangle of weeds and thorny bushes that had reclaimed the land with a wild, untamed ferocity. The paint, once a cheerful white, was now a peeling, leprous mosaic of gray and green. A broken window on the second floor, shattered by a thrown rock or the simple passage of time, stared out like a vacant, unblinking eye, a silent witness to the decay within and without. It was into this desolation that David Albright arrived, a man who saw not tragedy, but opportunity. A slick, pragmatic developer from a city 2 hours away, he represented the faceless, corporate future that many in Harmony Creek resented and feared. He had purchased the abandoned property for a fraction of its worth, with no emotional connection to its tragic history. For him, it was simply an asset to be cleared, a blank slate for a new profitable venture. He envisioned a small development of modern, modular homes, a fresh start on a piece of land tainted by the past. He hired a local cleanup crew, 2 men in their 40s who had grown up in Harmony Creek and remembered the Vance family, remembered the frantic search for the little girl in the red dress. They worked under a pale, indifferent sky, their chainsaws and heavy machinery a jarring, violent intrusion into the quiet stillness of the place. They were there to erase the past, to pave over the memories and build something new. But some things, once buried, refused to stay hidden. Near the back of the property, almost completely swallowed by a thicket of thorny weeds and creeping vines, sat a relic from another era, a vintage Wedgwood oven. Its heavy, porcelain-enameled body was streaked with deep, angry veins of rust, its once gleaming chrome trim dulled and pitted by years of neglect. It was a behemoth, a forgotten giant from the 1950s, a time when things were built to last, when kitchens were the heart of the home. It was too heavy to move easily, a monument of cast iron and steel, so it had been left to the mercy of the seasons, a silent, forgotten tomb in the overgrown grass. The 2 workers, their faces beaded with sweat, their shirts stained with dirt, grunted with effort as they pried at the corroded door. It was seized shut, sealed by years of rust and moisture. With a final, desperate heave, using a crowbar as a lever, the door gave way. It opened with a long, drawn-out groan of tortured metal, a sound that seemed to echo the pain of the place. A puff of stale, acrid air escaped, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, decay, and something else, something sharp and unsettlingly familiar, like burnt cloth. And inside, resting on the rusty, corroded wire rack, was a small, charred bundle. It wasn't just ash. It was fabric, partially burned but still recognizable. It was the unmistakable, horrifying remnant of a child's faded red dress. The fire had not consumed it completely. It had been smothered or had extinguished itself, leaving behind a blackened, brittle testament. There were no bones, no other remains, just the dress, a burnt offering left in the cold, dark belly of the oven. The silence where Amelia Vance used to be was suddenly filled with a new and terrifying question. What do you think will happen next in our story? Share your theories in the comments below while we continue this chilling tale. The discovery sent a shockwave through Harmony Creek, a jolt that reawakened the old, dormant grief. The story everyone had tried so hard to forget was suddenly, brutally new again. The county police, a larger, more modern force than Sheriff Brody's small department, took over the case. They arrived with new tools, new techniques, and a new determination. The search for Amelia Vance was over, but the search for the truth, for the darkness that had lurked just beneath the surface of their quiet town, had just begun. The discovery of the dress changed everything. The old cold story was now active, alive, with new, terrifying possibilities. It was no longer a missing person case, it was a potential homicide. In a sterile, brightly lit room in the county sheriff's department, a new team of detectives was assembled. Leading them was Detective Isabella Rossi, a sharp, intuitive woman in her late 30s who had grown up in a town much like Harmony Creek. She understood the dynamics of small-town life, the way secrets could fester and loyalties could blind. She began where Sheriff Brody had left off, with the old, dusty file box from the original 1998 search. She and her team carefully laid out its contents on a large metal table. Faded photographs, handwritten notes on yellowing legal pads, witness statements typed on an old manual typewriter. It was a time capsule of a failed investigation. They started with Amelia's sketchbook. It had been carefully preserved in an evidence bag, its pages filled with the vibrant, whimsical creatures of a child's imagination. But as Detective Rossi flipped through the drawings, she noticed something odd, something Sheriff Brody had apparently missed. A page had been carefully torn out, leaving a jagged, uneven edge near the binding. What had Amelia drawn on that missing page? And who would have removed it? Next, they revisited the original witness statements, looking for inconsistencies, for details that might have been overlooked. They decided to re-interview Brenda Gable. Now in her late 60s, her memory was even more of a tangled web than it had been in 1998. But Detective Rossi was patient. She sat with Brenda on her cluttered porch, sipping iced tea, letting her talk, guiding her gently back to that sweltering July afternoon. And as Brenda rambled on about the Vances, about Robert's drinking and Eleanor's pride, a single, crucial detail emerged. She remembered seeing Robert later that evening, near the edge of the woods. She had mentioned it to Sheriff Brody at the time, but what she hadn't emphasized, what had been lost in her rambling account, was that he had been carrying a shovel. A new one, she recalled, with a bright red handle. He was digging something, Brenda insisted, her rheumy eyes suddenly sharp with the clarity of memory. Digging in the dark. I thought he was burying something. The most significant breakthrough, however, came from Kyle Rossi. Now in his early 20s, the troubled teen had become a haunted young man. The detectives found him working the night shift at a gas station on the interstate, his eyes still holding the same sullen defensiveness they had 3 years earlier. But this time, under the weight of the new discovery, under the steady, non-judgmental gaze of Detective Rossi, he finally broke his long-held silence. He admitted, his voice barely a whisper, that he and Amelia had shared a secret friendship. He, the town outcast, and she, the quiet, watchful child, had found a strange sort of kinship. He had a hiding spot deep in the woods, a small, secluded clearing by a creek where he would go to escape his own troubled home life. And sometimes, Amelia would join him there. They would sit for hours, not saying much, just sharing the quiet. She was the only one who didn't look at me like I was garbage, Kyle said, his voice cracking with the weight of memory. She just saw me, the real me. He confessed that on the afternoon she disappeared, he had been in his hiding spot, waiting for her. She never showed up, but he had heard something. Shouting. He had crept closer to the edge of the woods and had seen Robert and Eleanor in their backyard, locked in a bitter, vicious argument. He hadn't seen what happened next, he insisted. He had been too scared to stick around, too afraid of getting blamed for something. But there was more, Detective Rossi could tell. A secret he was still holding back, a darkness still lurking behind his eyes. There was someone else in the woods that day, Kyle finally admitted, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. A man I'd never seen before. He was watching the house. Watching Amelia. I didn't say anything back then because I was scared, because no one would believe me over Robert Vance. Kyle described the man, tall, gaunt, with a face that seemed carved from stone and cold, dead eyes. But the detail that made Detective Rossi's blood run cold was the description of a long, jagged scar that ran across the back of the man's right hand, like a pale, twisted river. Our mysteries keep viewers guessing until the very end. Like and subscribe to be the first to know when we release new stories that will chill you to the bone. With these new clues, the detectives turned their attention back to the Vance family. They found Robert living in a rundown, anonymous apartment complex 100 miles from Harmony Creek. The years had not been kind to him. He was a shell of the man he once was, his face a roadmap of grief and regret, his hands trembling slightly. When they presented him with a photograph of the burned dress, his carefully constructed composure shattered. A wave of what looked like relief, profound and soul-crushing, washed over his face. And then the confession came tumbling out, a torrent of words held back for 3 long years. He told them it had been an accident. He had been drinking heavily that day, more than usual. He and Eleanor had been fighting, a bitter, vicious argument about money, about the factory, about the life that had been stolen from them. Amelia, he said, had run out of the house, her small face streaked with tears, begging them to stop. In his drunken, impotent rage, he had turned on her, shouting at her to go back inside. He had pushed her, just a shove, but he was bigger, stronger than he realized. She had stumbled backward, her feet tangling, and had fallen, her head hitting the sharp, unforgiving edge of a stone birdbath. He swore he never meant to hurt her. He had knelt beside her, his mind a thick fog of alcohol and horror, but it was too late. In a blind panic, consumed by a shame so profound it threatened to swallow him whole, he had carried her small, limp body into the woods and had buried her under the cover of darkness. The burned dress, he claimed, was his own desperate, twisted act of penance. He had returned to the abandoned house a few months before the cleanup crew arrived, driven by a guilt that had become an unbearable physical weight. He had dug up the dress, the last tangible piece of that horrible day, and had tried to burn it in the old oven, a symbolic act of purification. But he couldn't bring himself to do it, to completely obliterate that final memory of his daughter. He had left it, a passive confession, a subconscious cry for the truth to finally be unearthed, for his torment to end. Eleanor, when confronted with Robert's story, collapsed. Her carefully maintained facade of the grieving, abandoned wife crumbled, revealing the raw, festering wound beneath. She admitted that she had helped him cover it up, that the shared, terrible secret had been the true cause of their divorce. The weight of their lie had been a cancer, eating away at their marriage, their family, their very souls, until there was nothing left but silence and regret. It seemed like the mystery was solved. A tragic accident, a desperate cover-up, a family destroyed by guilt and secrets. It was a neat, heartbreaking story, the kind that made sense in a world where good people sometimes did terrible things. Robert Vance was charged, and the town of Harmony Creek breathed a collective sigh of pained relief. The ghost that had haunted them for 3 years finally had a face. But for Detective Rossi, it was too neat. There were inconsistencies, small, nagging details that didn't quite fit the narrative. Loose threads that, when pulled, threatened to unravel the entire story. Robert had given them a location in the woods, a specific spot where he claimed he had buried Amelia. But that area had been meticulously searched in 1998, with cadaver dogs and dozens of volunteers forming a human grid. They had found nothing. And Brenda Gable's memory of the shovel, the new shovel with the bright red handle, the timing didn't quite line up with Robert's confession. He claimed he had buried her in a panic, using an old spade from the shed. Why would he have a new shovel? But the biggest question, the one that kept Detective Rossi up at night, was the dress. Why burn it? And why leave it in a place where it was so certain to be found? Robert's explanation of a failed act of penance felt thin, theatrical. The act felt staged, a deliberate message. But if Robert hadn't left it, who had? The answer, she knew, had to be in the sketchbook. The missing page. It was the one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, the one clue that existed outside the Vance's tragic, self-contained narrative. Driven by a hunch that bordered on obsession, she and her partner returned to the abandoned Vance house one last time before it was scheduled to be demolished. They searched the dusty, forgotten corners of Amelia's room, a child's bedroom frozen in time, its walls still adorned with faded posters of pop stars and horses. And there, tucked inside an old, hollowed-out copy of Charlotte's Web, a book Amelia had reportedly loved, they found it. The missing page. The drawing was just as Detective Rossi had feared, and yet so much more chilling. It was a small, simple sketch of Kyle Rossi and Amelia in their secret clearing in the woods, two small figures in a world of green. But in the background, half hidden behind a thick oak tree, was another figure. A shadowy man Amelia had drawn with a distinct, unsettling feature, a long, jagged scar that snaked across the back of his right hand. What is heavier, the guilt of a crime or the silence of a witness? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Suddenly, the entire story shifted, the lens through which they had been viewing the mystery cracking and reforming into a new, terrifying picture. The detectives had been so focused on the family, on the internal drama of the Vance household, that they had missed the most obvious and most horrifying possibility. The real killer wasn't a member of the family. He was an outsider. They dove back into the old police records from 1998, their search now guided by a single chilling detail. They searched for any arrests or field interviews conducted in the weeks following Amelia's disappearance that mentioned a man with a scar on his hand. And there it was. A field interview report filed by a deputy and buried deep in the file. A transient, found sleeping in a barn on the outskirts of town, had been questioned and released. The deputy had noted his uncooperative attitude and, in a small, almost illegible scribble at the bottom of the report, had mentioned a nasty scar on his right hand. His name was in the report, Marcus Denton. They ran it through the national database. He was in a state prison in a neighboring state, serving a long sentence for a series of violent assaults. His booking photo was grainy, but there was no mistaking the scar. A twisted, pale line that ran from his knuckles to his wrist, the result of a prison fight years earlier. Detective Rossi and her partner drove the 3 hours to the prison. They found Denton in a small, sterile interrogation room. He was older now, his face hard and impassive, but his eyes held a cold, dead stillness that sent a chill down Rossi's spine. When they confronted him with the drawing, he smirked, denying everything. But when they told him about the burned dress, about the oven, his carefully constructed facade crumbled. A flicker of something, anger, surprise, frustration, flashed in his eyes. That dress was supposed to stay buried, he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. He wasn't supposed to move it. He confessed, not with remorse, but with a chilling, detached pride. He had been hiding out in the woods behind the Vance property, watching the family for days. He had seen the arguments, the drinking, the neglect. He had seen Amelia, a small, quiet girl who seemed to drift through the world unnoticed. He had lured her into the woods with a story about a lost puppy. What happened next, he described with a clinical detachment that made Detective Rossi's skin crawl. He had buried Amelia's body deep in the woods, in a place no searcher would ever think to look, not in the area near the Vance property that had been combed so thoroughly, but miles away, in a dense thicket near an abandoned quarry. He had buried her with the dress, a grim memento of his crime. Years later, from his prison cell, he had read a small news article about the sale of the Vance property. He had panicked. The dress was his trophy, a secret memento of his crime, a symbol of his power. He had contacted an old associate on the outside, a man who owed him a favor, and had sent him to retrieve it. But his associate, a petty criminal with no stomach for the ghosts of the past, had been spooked while digging up the grave. He had grabbed the dress, but in his haste to flee, had shoved it in the old, rusty oven, the first hiding place he saw before disappearing. The man with the scar had never intended for the dress to be found. It was supposed to remain his secret, his power. But fate, or perhaps Amelia herself, had other plans. The mystery of what happened to Amelia Vance was finally solved. Robert Vance was exonerated, his confession now understood as the desperate, guilt-ridden act of a broken man who believed he was responsible for his daughter's disappearance. The true horror, that a predator had been watching from the woods, waiting for his opportunity, was almost too much for the town to bear. A new search, guided by Denton's reluctant directions, found Amelia's remains. She was finally laid to rest in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town, her grave marked with a simple stone angel. The town of Harmony Creek could finally mourn its lost child, the true story even more horrifying than the one they had imagined. For the Vance family, the truth brought a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief. Robert and Eleanor, brought together by the shared trauma of their daughter's murder, found a measure of peace in the knowledge that they hadn't been responsible for her death. But the years of guilt, the toll of their misplaced shame, had left permanent scars. They would never be the people they once were, never reclaim the life that had been stolen from them twice. First by Amelia's disappearance, and then by their own misguided belief in their culpability. Kyle Rossi moved away from Harmony Creek soon after the truth came to light. The weight of his silence, the knowledge that he had seen the killer and had been too afraid to speak up, was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He would forever wonder if things might have been different if he had found the courage to tell the truth from the beginning. Detective Rossi closed the case file on Amelia Vance with a sense of grim satisfaction. Justice had been served, but it was a cold comfort. The story of Amelia, of the little girl with the sketchbook full of monsters and heroes, would stay with her. Sometimes, she thought, the monsters weren't just in the margins of a child's drawing. Sometimes they were watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment when no one was looking. As for the town of Harmony Creek, it slowly began to heal. The Vance property, once slated for development, was instead donated to the town and transformed into a small memorial park. The old house was torn down, the land reclaimed by nature. A simple stone marker was placed beneath the great oak tree where Amelia had once sat with her sketchbook, a quiet reminder of the child who had seen the world in a way others didn't. In the years that followed, the town began to change. New businesses opened on Main Street. Families moved in, drawn by the low cost of living and the tight-knit community that had been forged in the crucible of tragedy. Harmony Creek would never forget Amelia Vance, but it would no longer be defined solely by her loss. And on quiet summer afternoons, when the air is thick and heavy with the buzz of cicadas, some say they can still see a small figure sitting beneath the great oak tree, a sketchbook open on her lap. A watcher, forever capturing the quiet details of a world that had moved on without her. If you're captivated by mysteries like this one, be sure to hit subscribe and leave us a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more stories like these to life.